You ever seen someone give away their last meal like it meant nothing? The words didn't come from anyone nearby, but somehow they hung in the cold night air as Alicia Brooks stepped off the bus, her sneakers hitting the wet pavement with a quiet splash, the streetlights flickering above like they were too tired to keep shining, and in her hands, a small plastic container still warm from the diner where she had just finished a 12-hour shift, the smell of rice and beans rising faintly into the damp air. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders, the fabric already soaked through from the steady drizzle. But she didn't slow down, not tonight, not ever, because halfway down the block, right beside a flickering street lamp and a cracked concrete bench, he was there, exactly where he always was, the old man with silver hair matted against his forehead, his coat too light for the weather, his hands trembling not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something quieter, something most people walking past chose not to see. Alicia approached him like she always did, not with pity, not with hesitation, but with a kind of steady warmth that felt almost out of place in a city that moved too fast to notice anything that didn't shine. And she knelt down, ignoring the wet ground soaking through her jeans as she held out the container, her voice soft but certain. "Evening, sir," she said, like she was greeting someone in a place far more dignified than a sidewalk. And for a moment, the man didn't move, his eyes fixed on her like he was trying to understand something he hadn't felt in a long time. Then slowly, carefully, he reached out and took the food, his fingers brushing hers just for a second, cold against warm. Across the street, unseen by both of them, a black SUV sat idling at the curb, its headlights dimmed, but its presence impossible to ignore if anyone had bothered to look. Inside, a man in a tailored coat leaned forward slightly, his jaw tightening as he watched the scene unfold, his eyes not leaving Alicia as she shifted to sit beside the old man, pulling her knees close, talking to him in a low voice as if they had known each other for years. As if this moment wasn't unusual at all, and the man in the SUV exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the glass for just a second before disappearing, his hand gripping the steering wheel just a little tighter, because what he was seeing didn't make sense, not in the world he knew, not in the world where people calculated every move, every dollar, every advantage. And yet here she was, night after night, giving something away that she clearly didn't have much of to begin with. And as the rain continued to fall, tapping softly against the roof of the car and the pavement below, Alicia smiled at the old man, a quiet, genuine smile that didn't ask for anything in return, and for the first time in a long time, the man in the SUV felt something shift inside his chest, something uncomfortable, something he couldn't quite name, as if the life he had built so carefully was suddenly being measured against a single, simple act of kindness happening under a broken streetlight. The next night, the rain had stopped but the cold lingered, settling into the cracks of the sidewalk and the quiet spaces between passing cars, and Alicia Brooks walked the same route again, her steps slower now, her body carrying the weight of exhaustion that no amount of sleep ever seemed to fix. Her fingers curled tightly around another small container of food, this one lighter than usual because she had skipped her own dinner to make sure there was enough. And as she turned the corner, beneath the flickering streetlight, her eyes searched for him before anything else, scanning the empty bench, the darkened curb, the place where he always sat. But he was not there. She stopped mid-step, her breath catching slightly as the silence around her felt heavier than it should, like something had shifted when she was not looking, and she moved closer, her sneakers scraping softly against the pavement as she glanced down at the ground, at the faint outline where his worn shoes usually rested, at the spot where the cardboard he used as a cushion had been, now gone. Alicia lowered herself slowly onto the bench, the cold seeping through her clothes instantly, the container still warm in her hands but suddenly feeling out of place, like it no longer had a purpose, and she looked up and down the street, watching strangers pass without noticing her, without noticing anything at all, their footsteps quick, their eyes forward, their lives untouched by the quiet absence that now sat beside her. Across the street, the black SUV was there again, parked in the same shadow, engine low, and inside, the man watched as Alicia remained seated longer than usual, her posture still but not empty, her eyes fixed on the space where the old man should have been, and something in her expression made his chest tighten in a way he could not explain, because it was not panic, Not frustration, but something softer, something like concern that had nowhere to go. Alicia finally set the container down beside her. Unopened, untouched, her fingers lingering on the lid for a second before pulling away, and she let out a slow breath. The kind that carried more than just air, the kind that held back questions she did not say out loud, like where he had gone, if he had found shelter, if he had eaten, if he was warm somewhere or still out in the cold, unseen by everyone except the one person who had come back for him night after night. A gust of wind moved down the street, lifting a loose piece of paper that skidded across the pavement before settling near her feet, and she watched it without really seeing it, her mind replaying the small moments she had shared with him, the quiet thank yous, the way he held the container carefully like it mattered, the way he listened when she spoke as if her words were worth something. And for the first time, Alicia felt the weight of not knowing, the kind that did not come with answers, only silence. Inside the SUV, the man leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving her as he reached for his phone but stopped before dialing, his thumb hovering above the screen as if unsure of what action could possibly match what he was witnessing, because this was not a transaction, not a strategy, not something that could be solved with a decision or a number. And as Alicia slowly stood, picking up the untouched food and holding it close to her chest, she took one last look at the empty space before turning away, her steps quieter now, more uncertain, while behind her, unseen, the man in the SUV finally made a choice, his door unlocking with a soft click that disappeared into the night air. The soft click of the car door closing echoed faintly behind her, but Alicia Brooks did not turn around, her focus still locked on the quiet weight in her chest as she walked down the dimly lit street, the container of food now cooling in her hands, its warmth fading just like the certainty she had carried every night before, and the sound of measured footsteps began to follow at a distance, steady but unhurried, until a voice, calm and unfamiliar, broke through the silence. "You came back for him," and Alicia stopped, her shoulders tensing slightly before she turned to see the man from the SUV standing a few feet away, his coat pressed, his posture composed, yet his eyes carrying something unsettled beneath the surface. She studied him for a moment, not intimidated, not impressed, just curious in a quiet way that made him shift slightly under her gaze, and she answered simply, he was hungry, as if that explained everything, as if no further reasoning was needed, and the man exhaled softly, glancing past her toward the empty bench before looking back again. "You do that every night?" he asked, his tone controlled but edged with something deeper, and Alicia nodded once, adjusting her grip on the container. "When I can," she said, her voice steady despite the fatigue that lined her eyes. "Some nights I bring more, some nights it is just enough, but he always says thank you like it matters." And the man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his gaze lowering for a second before lifting again. "You do not even know who he is," he said, not as a question but as a statement, and Alicia gave a small, almost tired smile. "I know he is someone who needed to eat," she replied, and for a moment, the space between them fell into silence, filled only by the distant hum of traffic and the faint rustle of wind moving through the empty street. The man took a step closer, his polished shoes quiet against the pavement. "What if I told you he is not who you think?" "He is," he said carefully, watching her reaction, but Alicia did not step back, did not look surprised. She simply held his gaze and answered, "Then I guess he is still someone who needed to eat." And something in that response landed heavier than he expected, his composure slipping just enough to reveal the conflict underneath, the kind that came from realizing something simple had been overlooked for far too long. He looked away briefly, his eyes tracing the outline of the bench, the empty space, the absence that had brought them both here, before speaking again, quieter now. "He is in the hospital," he said, and Alicia's fingers tightened slightly around the container, the only sign that the words had reached deeper than she would show. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked, her voice softer now, carrying a weight that had not been there before, and the man hesitated, just for a second, before answering. "They say he will be," and Alicia nodded slowly, her shoulders easing just a fraction as she let out a breath she had been holding since she noticed the empty bench, and she glanced down at the food in her hands, then back up at him. "Can I bring this to him?" she asked, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, as if nothing about this moment had changed what she intended to do. And the man stared at her, something shifting again behind his eyes, something closer to disbelief now. Because even with the truth standing right in front of her, even with the situation changed, she had not. And for the first time, he realized that whatever he thought he understood about people, about value, about worth, might have been incomplete all along. The man did not answer right away, his eyes fixed on the container in Alicia's hands as if it carried more weight than it should. Then he gestured quietly toward the black SUV. "It is late," he said, his voice lower now, less guarded. "I can take you there." And Alicia hesitated, not out of fear, but because stepping into a stranger's world had never been part of her routine. Yet the thought of the old man alone in a hospital bed, without something warm to eat, pulled her forward stronger than doubt ever could. So she nodded once and followed him across the street, her sneakers soft against the pavement while the city hummed quietly around them. The door of the SUV opened with a muted sound, the interior glowing with a soft, controlled light that felt distant from the cold outside, and Alicia stepped in carefully, holding the container close to her chest as if it might spill something more than food if she let go, while the man slid into the driver's seat, his movements precise but slower than before, as if something inside him had shifted and he was still adjusting to it. The car moved through the city streets smoothly, passing blocks Alicia knew too well, then turning into areas she had only ever seen from a distance, where buildings rose taller, windows brighter, and silence felt more expensive, and she watched quietly, her reflection faint against the glass, not impressed, not overwhelmed, just observant, while the man glanced at her once, then back to the road. "You did not ask my name," he said after a moment, and Alicia gave a small shrug. "You did not ask mine either," she replied, her tone calm, and for a second, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth before fading. "Daniel," he said, his voice steady. "My name is Daniel Whitmore." And Alicia nodded. "Alicia Brooks," she answered, the exchange simple, equal, without weight or hierarchy. And that alone made his grip on the wheel tighten slightly. The hospital came into view soon after, its white lights cutting through the night, steady and unyielding. And as the car slowed to a stop, Daniel turned off the engine but did not move immediately, his hands resting on the wheel, as if he needed a moment before stepping into what waited inside. And Alicia noticed, her gaze softening just slightly as she said, "He is still your father, not as comfort, not as judgment, but as something in between, something that landed deeper than any reassurance could." And Daniel nodded once, the movement small but deliberate, before stepping out of the car. Inside, the hospital air was warm but carried that familiar sterile stillness, the quiet echo of footsteps, the low hum of machines, and Alicia followed Daniel down a long hallway, her eyes taking in everything without distraction, her focus narrowing only when they stopped outside a room where the door was slightly open, lights spilling into the corridor like a quiet invitation, and Daniel paused there, his hand hovering near the handle but not pushing it yet, as if crossing that threshold meant facing more than just the man inside. And Alicia stepped forward gently, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not have to do it alone." And without waiting for permission, she reached out and nudged the door open, the soft creak breaking the silence as both of them stepped into the room where the old man lay resting, his face calmer now, his breathing steady. And for the first time since the empty bench, Alicia's shoulders relaxed just slightly, the tension easing as she moved closer, setting the container down on the small table beside him, while behind her, Daniel stood still, watching, not just the man in the bed, but the woman who had followed him here without hesitation, without expectation, and somehow, without realizing it, had already changed something he had not been able to fix for years. The quiet rhythm of the heart monitor filled the room, steady and soft, like a reminder that something fragile was still holding on, and Alicia Brooks stood beside the bed, her eyes fixed on the old man's face as if searching for the same presence she had come to know under that broken streetlight. But here, in the clean white glow of the hospital room, he looked different, not just because of the setting, but because the distance between who he had been outside and who he was now felt harder to bridge. She reached out slowly, adjusting the thin blanket near his shoulder with a careful touch, the same quiet respect she had shown him every night, as if his dignity did not depend on where he was. And behind her, Daniel Whitmore remained near the doorway, his posture stiff, his hands resting at his sides like he was unsure where they belonged, his gaze shifting between his father and Alicia, caught somewhere between recognition and regret. He used to hate hospitals, Daniel said. Finally, his voice low, almost as if speaking too loudly. Might disturb more than just the room, and Alicia glanced back at him, her expression calm. Most people do, she replied gently, then turned her attention back to the man in the bed. But he does not have to be alone here, she added, her words simple, but carrying something that settled heavily in the space between them. Daniel took a slow step forward, his shoes quiet against the polished floor, and for a moment, he looked like someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times but never quite knew how it would feel when it became real. His eyes tracing the lines of his father's face, the familiar features softened by time and exhaustion, and he swallowed once before speaking again. He was not always like this, he said, more to himself than to her. There was a time when he had everything under control, when people listened to him, when I did. And his voice faltered just slightly at the end, the words hanging unfinished in the air. Alicia did not respond right away. Instead, she picked up the container she had brought, opening it slowly as the faint warmth escaped into the room, the scent subtle but grounding, and she placed it gently on the table within reach, as if preparing for a moment that had not happened yet, but still mattered. People do not stop needing care just because life changes, she said quietly, her eyes still on the old man. Sometimes they need it more. And Daniel let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction as her words settled into something deeper than explanation. The old man shifted slightly then, a small movement, barely noticeable, but enough to draw both of their attention instantly, and Alicia leaned in just a little, her voice soft. Sir, she said, the same way she always had, the same respect, the same warmth, and for a moment, it felt like the distance between the sidewalk and this room disappeared entirely, like the world had narrowed down to something simple and real again. Daniel stepped closer, his presence no longer held back by hesitation. And as he looked down at his father, something in his expression changed, the sharp edges of control, giving way to something quieter, something more honest. And in that stillness, he began to understand that what Alicia had been offering all along was not just food, not just kindness, but something far more difficult to give and far more powerful to receive, something he had spent years overlooking without even realizing it. The room settled into a quiet that felt almost sacred, the kind that made every small sound stand out. The soft hum of the machines, the faint rustle of fabric as Alicia Brooks adjusted her stance beside the bed, and the slow, uneven rhythm of the old man's breathing as it filled the space between them. And for a moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because anything louder than silence felt unnecessary. Alicia reached for a chair and pulled it closer, the legs scraping lightly against the floor. Then she sat down, her movements unhurried, her presence steady as she rested her hands loosely in her lap, her gaze never leaving the man she had known only as a quiet figure under a streetlight, and now as someone lying in a place that felt too sterile for the life he had lived outside. Daniel Whitmore stood just behind her, watching, his reflection faint in the glass of the window, the city lights beyond flickering like distant reminders of a world that had once felt so controlled, so predictable, and now seemed uncertain in ways he could not quite define. And he shifted his weight slightly, as if trying to find a place for himself in a moment that did not belong to the version of him he had been. Alicia leaned forward just a little, her voice low, almost like a whisper meant only for the man in the bed. You did not finish your dinner tonight, she said softly, a gentle familiarity in her tone, as if continuing a conversation that had never been interrupted. And though there was no response, no visible change, she did not pull away. She stayed, her presence filling the silence in a way words never could. Daniel watched her, something tightening in his chest again. But this time it was not confusion, it was recognition, the realization that what he was witnessing was not an act, not something performed for attention or reward, but something rooted deeper, something that existed whether anyone saw it or not. And he found himself taking another step closer, drawn in by a kind of gravity he had never learned to measure. The old man's fingers moved slightly then, a faint, almost imperceptible motion against the blanket, and Alicia noticed immediately, her hand lifting gently to rest near his without fully touching, as if giving him the choice to close the distance, and after a second, his hand shifted again, brushing lightly against hers, the contact brief but real, and Alicia's expression softened, a quiet smile forming as she let out a slow breath. "That is better," she murmured, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to reach beyond the room itself. Daniel felt something shift again, something deeper this time, something that did not come with logic or explanation, and he looked down at his father, at the man he had once believed needed control, solutions, answers, and for the first time, he understood that what had been missing was none of those things, but something far simpler and far harder to give, something Alicia had offered without hesitation, without calculation, without ever needing to name it. He lowered himself slowly into the chair on the other side of the bed, the movement quiet but deliberate, his eyes not leaving his father's face as he spoke, his voice no longer carrying the edge it once had. "I should have been here," he said, not expecting a response, not asking for one, just letting the truth settle into the space between them. And Alicia did not interrupt, did not correct. She simply remained where she was, her presence steady, her silence supportive, as the room held them both in a moment that felt less like an ending and more like something beginning to take shape, something fragile, something honest, something that could not be rushed, only felt. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like something beneath the surface finally rising, and Daniel Whitmore leaned forward in his chair, his elbows resting on his knees as he watched the faint movement in his father's chest, each breath steady but fragile, and for the first time in years. He did not look at his watch, did not reach for his phone, did not think about anything beyond that room, beyond that moment. Alicia Brooks remained beside the bed, her hand still near his father's, not forcing contact, just present, just there, and the soft overhead light cast a gentle glow across her face, highlighting the calm certainty in her expression, the kind that came from knowing exactly why she was there without needing to explain it. A nurse passed quietly by the doorway, pausing for a brief second as she glanced in, then continuing on, the world outside the room moving forward as it always did. But inside, time felt different, slower, more deliberate, as if it had finally given them space to catch up with what had been missed. Daniel let out a quiet breath, his voice low when he finally spoke. "He used to wake up before sunrise every day," he said, his eyes still fixed on his father. "He would make coffee, strong enough that you could smell it from the hallway, and he would sit at the table like he had all the time in the world, even when he did not." And his words carried a softness that had not been there before, a memory unfolding in real time. "I never sat with him long enough," he added, almost to himself, and Alicia listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, her presence offering space rather than answers. The old man's eyelids shifted then, just slightly, a small movement that caught both of their attention instantly, and Daniel straightened, his breath catching as he leaned closer. "Dad," he said quietly, the word unfamiliar on his tongue after so much time, and the old man's eyes opened slowly, not fully, just enough to reveal a faint awareness, a flicker of recognition that passed between them like something long delayed. Alicia eased back just a little, giving them space without stepping away, her hand lowering gently to her lap, and Daniel swallowed, his voice unsteady now. "I am here," he said, the words simple but heavy with everything that had not been said before, and for a moment, the old man's gaze shifted, moving past him slightly until it landed on Alicia, and something in his expression softened, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips as if he recognized her presence before anything else. Daniel noticed, his eyes following that line of sight, and the realization settled into him with quiet force, not as jealousy, not as resentment, but as understanding, because the connection in that moment was not built on history or obligation, but on something immediate, something honest that Alicia had given without knowing who he was. The old man's lips parted slightly, his voice barely audible as he whispered, something that neither of them could fully catch, but Alicia leaned in just enough, her expression warm. "It is okay," she said softly. "You can rest." And the old man's eyes closed again, not in absence, but in peace, his breathing evening out as the tension left his face. Daniel sat back slowly, his gaze shifting between his father and Alicia, and for the first time, the weight he carried did not feel like something he had to control, but something he had to face. And in that quiet room, with no audience, no expectations, just the steady rhythm of breath and presence, he began to understand that what mattered most had never been the things he had spent his life chasing, but the moments he had nearly lost, and the person who had shown him that without ever asking for anything in return. Morning arrived quietly, not with noise or urgency, but with a soft wash of pale light slipping through the tall hospital window, settling gently across the room like a calm breath. And Alicia Brooks had not moved far from where she had been, her posture relaxed but attentive, her presence steady as if time itself had slowed to match the rhythm of the man resting beside her. While Daniel Whitmore stood near the window now, his silhouette outlined by the early light, his reflection faint against the glass as he stared out at a city that suddenly felt unfamiliar in its priorities. The night had shifted something in him, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, undeniable ways, like a quiet truth that could no longer be ignored. And when he turned back toward the bed, his eyes lingered not just on his father, but on Alicia, the woman who had walked into this space without hesitation and somehow held it together without trying. "You stayed," he said finally, his voice low, carrying something softer now, and Alicia looked up at him, her expression simple, almost puzzled. "He needed someone here," she replied, as if that alone was reason enough, as if anything more complicated would have missed the point entirely, and Daniel nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling into him deeper than any explanation ever had. He took a few steps closer, stopping near the foot of the bed, his gaze lowering briefly before lifting again. "I have spent years thinking I was doing everything right," he said, his voice steady but quieter than before, "providing, building, controlling outcomes, but I never thought about what he actually needed." And Alicia listened, not interrupting, not correcting, just allowing the moment to unfold as it was, her silence giving his words space to exist without judgment. The old man stirred again then, his eyes opening more fully this time, the light catching in them as his gaze slowly adjusted. And when he looked between them, there was a clarity there now, a quiet awareness that had not been present before, and Daniel stepped closer instinctively, his voice softer. "I am here," he repeated, the words no longer uncertain, no longer rehearsed, but real, and the old man's expression shifted, something easing in his features as he looked at his son, then at Alicia, and back again, as if connecting something that had finally come together. Alicia stood slowly, giving them space once more, but she did not leave, her hand resting lightly on the back of the chair as she watched, her presence still grounding the room in a way that did not demand attention but held meaning nonetheless. Daniel hesitated for a brief second, then moved closer to the bed, his hand lifting slightly before settling gently over his father's, the contact simple but deliberate. And the old man responded with a faint squeeze, the gesture small but powerful, enough to shift the air around them, and Daniel exhaled slowly, a breath that carried years of distance and something like release. He looked back at Alicia then, his eyes no longer guarded, no longer calculating, but open in a way that surprised even him. "Thank you," he said, not as a formality, not as an obligation, but as something genuine, something that came from a place he had not visited in a long time. And Alicia gave a small nod, her expression unchanged. "You are welcome," she answered simply, as if she had not done anything extraordinary, as if she had only done what anyone should have done. And that was what made it matter most. Outside, the city continued as it always did. Traffic moving, people rushing, lives unfolding without pause. But inside that quiet hospital room, something had slowed enough to be seen clearly, something had shifted enough to be felt, and though nothing had been promised, nothing declared, there was a quiet understanding settling into place, one that did not need words to be real, only presence to continue. The afternoon light stretched longer now, softer, warmer, spilling across the hospital floor in quiet lines that moved slowly with time, and Alicia Brooks stood near the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the frame as she took one last look into the room, The steady rhythm of the monitors still present, the air calmer than it had been the night before, and Daniel Whitmore sat beside the bed, his posture no longer rigid, his hands still resting over his father's, not out of obligation, but out of choice, and for the first time, it looked natural, like something he had remembered rather than something he had learned. Alicia adjusted the strap of her worn bag over her shoulder, her eyes lingering for just a moment on the small container now empty on the table, a quiet reminder that something simple had found its place in a space that once felt distant, and without needing to say anything, she turned to leave, her steps soft against the polished floor, her presence already fading. Into the rhythm of the hospital. Daniel noticed her movement and stood quickly, not rushed, but certain. "Alicia," he called, his voice steady but carrying something new, something that had not been there before, and she paused, turning back slightly, her expression calm as always, waiting without expectation, and he walked toward her. Stopping a few feet away, the space between them no longer defined by difference, but by something quieter, something understood. "I spent years thinking I had to build everything myself," he said, his voice low, measured. "But I did not know how to show up when it mattered most." And Alicia listened, her gaze steady, not judging, not softening, just present, and he continued. "You did that without being asked, without knowing anything about us." And he exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he had been holding onto for too long. "I cannot change what I missed, but I can choose what I do now." And for a moment, the hallway fell into that same quiet stillness, the kind that allowed truth to settle without resistance. Alicia gave a small nod, her voice gentle but firm. "Then be there," she said simply, the words carrying no weight beyond their meaning. And that was exactly why they mattered, and Daniel nodded in return, the understanding clear in his expression, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just real. She turned again, this time continuing down the hallway without looking back, her steps steady, her figure blending into the quiet movement of the building. And as the door behind her closed softly, the sound was not an ending, but a transition, a quiet shift from one moment into the next. Daniel stood there for a second longer, then turned back toward the room, toward his father, toward the space that now felt less like something to manage and more like something to be part of. And he walked back inside, pulling the chair closer again, sitting down with a calm that did not need to be forced, his hand finding his father's once more, not because he had to, but because he chose to stay. Outside, the city carried on, unchanged, cars moving, people rushing, lives continuing without pause. But inside that room, something had slowed enough to be felt, something had been seen clearly enough to matter. And though Alicia Brooks was no longer there, the quiet strength she carried remained, not in words, not in promises, but in the simple act of staying when it counted. And in the silence that followed, there was no need for anything more.